Well, welcome to another video in this series. My name is Thom and I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Gender and Cultural Studies at the University of Sydney and a Professor too in the Oslo School of Environmental Humanities at the University of Oslo. And it's a real pleasure to have had the opportunity today to sit and chat with one of my favourite people, Professor Anna Singh. Over to you, Anna.
Hi, I'm Anna Singh, and I teach anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and sometimes at Aarhus University in Denmark. I'm really pleased to be here with you, Thom.
Great. So we've just got some sort of general topics we're going to chat about, things, shared interests, things that overlap between our work, or a lot of the time things we would love to work together on but haven't quite got around to. So first off on my list is to ask you about one of your latest projects, which is something I've been watching from a distance. That's a really exciting project called the Feral Atlas. Could you tell us a little about it?
Sure, thank you. Feral Atlas is a work of digital scholarship. It brings together natural sciences, social sciences, the arts, and humanities. I think sometimes when scholars take a quick look at it, they think it's just an art project, and it certainly is an art project, but it also is trying to give an account of the Anthropocene in a way that we believe is original and important. That is, to recognize the spatial patchiness of the Anthropocene, its heterogeneity, the way that it builds up from many different kinds of pieces, and therefore also the kinds of temporal heterogeneities, the many kinds of timelines that come together in bringing us into this moment of environmental difficulty as non-humans have responded to all the kinds of earth-altering projects that humans have put into place and have become collaborators in the worst sense of the term with the environmental dangers that we're a part of. And we do this in part by having solicited field reports from scientists and observers of all different sorts, not only across disciplines, but including Indigenous elders, as well as people speaking from their vernacular experience. We put these together with an analysis of how we understand the Anthropocene. And it's a digital project that's interactive and beautiful, and we try and bring the concepts to life by through kinds of visual materials and a spirit of exploration for the viewer. We're hoping the viewers bring this to their everyday lives.
Yeah, it is such a beautiful project. And what is it though about ferality that offers a really interesting window on the Anthropocene?
By feral, we mean we're looking at non-humans whose ways of being have been altered by the projects that humans have done. So they've changed in relation to human projects. On the other hand, they're not under human control. So it's this double sense that they're not out there just doing their ordinary things. They've changed in relation to human projects, but they're not under human control. So our feral entities range from carbon dioxide, of course, produced from burning fossil fuels, to cane toads that have run through northern Australia, killing off many indigenous animals.
Yeah. Great. So it's in a way, I guess it's a category that helps to explore more than human agencies and sort of co-worlding. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So we look at how these feral entities are remaking the world together with humans, even though not in the ways that humans would like.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Okay. And we were talking earlier about connections to others, to sort of public storytelling more generally. I guess your project has, as you were just saying, contributions from all sorts of people, academics and scientists. But so is there something about trying to broaden the voices involved in that discussion that is at the heart of that project in some way.
Yes, I think very much that we are completely unequipped to handle our environmental challenges without bringing in all different kinds of people whose knowledges are different than each other, that we don't have a chance if we keep to the old way that the academy was organized, not only to exclude forms of knowledge that weren't part of the tradition that gets inside the academy, but also to separate the humanities with a deep gap from the sciences. And this has made it almost impossible to study environmental challenges. So it's incredibly important part of the project to bring these diverse voices together, but without expecting them to homogenize and to form a single voice, but instead to show how we can understand the Anthropocene better through the patchiness of the voices as well as of the phenomena that make up the Anthropocene.
Yeah.
But maybe this is a good moment to push it in your direction. We can come back to Feral Atlas, of course, but tell me a little about the kinds of public storytelling projects that you've been involved in.
Yeah, well, a few of them lately, and one of those that's sort of really building some interesting momentum in the last year and a half or so is the Urban Field Naturalist project, which is also online and is a community storytelling portal where people submit stories about encounters with wildlife, usually in urban environments, although we interpret all these things pretty broadly. And it wasn't originally imagined as a lockdown project. It was something we've been talking about for a few years. And so the team is me and two biologists and two designers. And you can look up the team on the urbanfieldnaturalist.org. And so, yeah, we've been talking about it for a while, but when people got put into lockdown in different parts of the world, we thought this was a particularly interesting opportunity to create more space for people to explore their encounters with wildlife on their balconies or backyards or parks or wherever it is. So that's what we did. There's a portal for people to share their own stories, but then there's also a set of resources for a guide to crow appreciation, a guide to studying the movements of snails in your own backyard. We're working on a guide to hoverflies, which most people don't even notice, but it's part of a guide to staring at flowers, which is, it turns out, according to one of my biologist collaborators, a fascinating thing to do, to watch these comings and goings. So yeah, we are creating those kinds of resources as well to equip people in different ways to do that kind of exploratory work. And we're playing with the idea of an urban field naturalist in contrast to a citizen scientist, and exploring what it means to inherit that naturalist tradition in the Anthropocene epoch, with all of its problems, as well as its considerable interdisciplinarities, I think, which aligns with what you were just saying, that the naturalist tradition has long blurred art and science, ethics and philosophy, and been as much about wonder and appreciation of the natural world as it is about data and so on. So we're trying to capture some of that without losing sight of the fact that, of course, the naturalist tradition has been deeply implicated in histories of colonization and extraction and more. And so, again, part of grappling with that has been to try and diversify voices and to think about what all of the different kinds of perspectives, different parts of the community might contribute to thinking about urban wildlife, might bring their traditional stories, cultural stories, into dialogue with the sciences. So yeah, it's an interesting generative project that is, I think, like a lot of the work you do, Anna, about interdisciplinary play as much as anything else.
Can you tell us one of the stories that was submitted that for some reason impressed you?
Oh, one of the nicest stories, in my view, anyway. I mean, there's so many, and I mean, some of them are really just fascinating tidbits because they're usually just short 200-word stories. So, one of them is a meditation on wombat poo. Wombats lay sort of cube-shaped poos, so they're quite interesting. So it's a reflection on that. There's all sorts of others on wasps laying their eggs in spiders and dragging spiders around, and so things that are going on around people in the environment every day that they've taken a moment to observe. But one story that really stood out, which is a bit longer, came from a teenage student in Delhi who observed a pair of sunbirds nesting in a pair of underwear hanging on a clothesline. And so she's meticulously documented this process of the laying of the eggs. And I think she actually sealed up the end of the underwear with a peg to help keep the eggs in there, because it was a bit precarious. Anyway, then she's documented the chicks, the eggs hatching, and the parents coming and feeding them. And it's a beautiful story with pictures and some little videos that she's made. And in the background of some of the videos, you can hear her teacher homeschooling all of the kids in lockdown, while she's obviously observing things out her window. So yeah, it's a particularly nice story.
Yesterday, a student of mine of Mexican origin who had gone home to Mexico over the summer told me about a flock of butterflies that she observed in the middle of Mexico City, in the middle of traffic, but roosting in trees. And she said she asked people about them and they couldn't even see them in many cases. But she found them completely fascinating, that they had figured out a way in the midst of a kind of urban jungle to make a place for themselves.
Yeah, it's a fascinating moment, I guess, with the way people, or all of the very interesting things that are happening in lockdown, and it's not just about lockdown, but it's about reduced travel and all sorts of other things that have opened up space for the kinds of feral possibilities that you're exploring. But I think that's fascinating, and studying it is fascinating. And some of the biologists doing that and cataloging it, and I've now forgotten the name of the project that's run by, or one of the people running it is Christian Roos at St Andrews, documenting all of these stories about changes in animal behaviour and distribution as a result of lockdown, and this phenomenon they're calling the anthropause. But that I think is fascinating. And I think there's a side project that hasn't been done yet, exploring how that is being narrated by everyone from David Attenborough to National Geographic to tabloids, and this deep desire people seem to have to want to see nature bouncing back, and I think sometimes that's the story, and I think what the scientific work is showing is that it's not always the story, and that sometimes animals are not better off in the absence of humans. So anyway, I think there's a lot of interesting projects to be done here in thinking about these last few years. But I digress. So what I would like to ask you about also, if I can steer us on a little bit, is the kind of multi-species studies, multi-species ethnography space. That's another overlap in our interests, and something we co-edited an issue on a few years ago. And I know, you've done work on all sorts of ways on all sorts of creatures, but I guess are best known for your fungal explorations. So yeah, maybe would you tell us a bit about the mushroom at the end of the world and your fungi work?
Well, one of the really exciting things about doing that research that was different than research I had done before is that everyone I talked to was so excited about telling me about mushrooms. And I did that research before the rest of the world caught up and got interested in mushrooms. So I was really surprised that mushroom pickers, mushroom businessmen, foresters in areas where there were mushrooms, as well as biologists, all kinds of people, and of course, chefs were so thrilled to tell me what they knew about mushrooms and their stories in just some of the ways that you're talking about trying to revitalize natural history, always overlapped between what they wanted to tell me about the worlds of the mushrooms themselves and human worlds, that they always took into account both the trajectories of the mushrooms and the trajectories of the people that got involved in mushroom worlds. So that sense of what the pickers called mushroom fever certainly caught me up. I got involved in that very same fever to learn to talk about the kinds of natural histories in which forests and mushrooms, produce each other on the one hand, and in which humans get involved with these same mushrooms. And I was working on matsutake mushrooms, an aromatic gourmet mushroom much loved in Japan. And it turns out that they are mushrooms that do well in kinds of environments that maybe other kinds of plants and fungi don't do so well in. So the stories they had to tell about the disturbance ecologies in which these mushrooms grew were particularly exciting to me.
That's interesting. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about that. Yes, the disturbance ecologies of Matsutake, and then the feral atlas, and this thread in your work of exploring disturbed environments, impure places, is very interesting. And I guess as someone who works mostly on endangered species conservation, I guess I'm interested in those creatures, but they're often around the edges of the stories I tell, or causing trouble at the center. But you're very much an edge storyteller. Is that fair?
I think that's true, but I probably should say that I didn't mean The Mushroom at the End of the World to be a hopeful story in the sense that if we don't do anything, everything will work out fine. But some readers interpreted it that way, rather to my surprise, because I was, in my opinion, talking about what difficulty we're in at the end of the hold of progress narratives that tell us that everything's going to get better and better and work out whatever we do. Without those narratives, it's actually quite challenging to figure out how to navigate around the world. But in response to readers who thanked me for telling a kind of transcendental hope story that I didn't believe I was telling, part of my motivation for Feral Atlas came from that, because I think we're in a time of incredible environmental challenges. And I don't want to, just give up and die. On the other hand, I don't want to be telling a mistaken story that everything is fine. And I don't want to be telling the story of how human disturbance ecologies are always great, because they're not. So the challenge of Feral Atlas for me was to tell quite sometimes, not entirely, but often quite terrifying stories that could really hurt the abilities of humans and other species to live well. How can we tell those stories in a way that doesn't make us want to give up in despair, but instead makes us want to learn more, to get involved, to think with those examples? That seemed to me a challenge for those of us in the environmental humanities who are concerned with the ways that stories are told, as well as the stories themselves. So the big challenge for Feral Atlas was, can we tell stories about all of this extra carbon dioxide, or the ways that cane toads are wreaking havoc on Northern Australian ecologies? Can we tell those stories in a way that gets viewers and readers involved in them, wanting to learn more, rather than just abandoning things and saying, oh, well, the ship is sinking? So that was the big challenge.
Yeah, it's a very relatable problem for me, and I think I do like I write mostly about extinction and conservation, so I'm happy when I'm told that my work is sort of unexpectedly hopeful. But I am sometimes a bit worried when there seems to be such a straight line between the kinds of stories we want to tell that are that are about co-becoming, that are about avoiding those kind of singular grand narratives of progress and finding alternatives, that are about, you know, staying with the trouble, as Donna would say, and thinking that somehow that kind of framing has has created room for an anything goes kind of scenario. That really worries me too. And I think it's that, which in a way, I guess is, I mean, it's a point I think Donna's made many times. It's a point you've made. But I guess it's a point that I think is at the heart of Ava Gerard's book on what comes after entanglement, that need to not just celebrate the entangledness of the world and the co-becoming of the world, but to make a stand, or as Donna would say, to cast our lot with some ways of life and not others. And so finding your way through multiplicity and messiness and entanglement and making a stand for something that I think is so important and is going on in your work.
Well, talk a little about when you write about extinction, what your thinking is about how to tell those stories as well as possible.
Yeah, I think in the Crow, my Crow book, The Wake of Crows, I think the title sort of fell into place at, very late in the piece because the press didn't like the original title. So it's not a title that I had been working with or thinking with very much at all in the actual writing of the book. But somehow it sort of, it fell into place in a way that felt natural, and in large part because of this term wake, which aligned really nicely, I think, with something you were just saying, that a desire to bear witness to death, and at the same time not in a spirit of kind of absolute grief and mournfulness, but to hold that mourning alongside a kind of celebration of a life and a kind of wonder and appreciation for what has been and what might still be. And so that sense of the wake as both a space of grief and celebration really ended up working well in my thinking, and I sort of it's something I had been thinking about in flight ways, but not explicitly. That is really at the heart of the way I try to write extinction stories, and I think it's why people sometimes see them as unexpectedly hopeful, that they are trying to create a space of wonder and appreciation, even as they document unravelings and death and difficulty. And I think that's an obligation of the kind of storytelling that we need at this time. That it can't just be. It has to create not necessarily, you know, unrealistic optimism about the world, but I think of hope not as unrealistic optimism, but as a kind of commitment to care for the future. And I think we do have to cultivate that commitment to care for the future, and no matter how difficult and how damaged, as you've written about, that the planet is. And part of how we do that, I think, is to hold open room for that kind of wonder and appreciation, no matter how hard or bad the stories we're telling are. So yeah, I think of that as one of the real challenges of well, probably all Anthropocene storytelling. And as you were speaking, also, I was thinking how some of my recent work has been on Hawaiian snails, and how similar they are to the fungi in some ways, in the kind of unappreciatedness, but also how thrilled snail scientists are to talk about snails. It was just a very different experience for me to some of the other more charismatic species that I've worked on, and the deep desire of people to share those stories and have them out there, and not just the scientists, but other cultural practitioners, activists, other people who are working around the snails and often feeling unseen. So that's I guess a need for more uncharismatic stories.
Tell us the name of the new book on snails that you've written.
I think it's called A World in a Shell, Snail Stories for a Time of Extinctions, but my books have a tendency to have their titles changed at the last minute, so we'll see. But it's coming out next year with MIT Press. Yeah, and was a really lovely move from having written about birds mostly to writing about very different kinds of creatures. And I think it really helped me to, which I guess is another, well, that's something I'd love to ask you about in just a second, about the different kinds of capacities, mental capacities, ecological relationships of the different creatures that we write about, different species. For me, the transition from writing about crows, who are so intelligent and at least in the ways humans think about and study these things generally, such rich social lives, getting up to all sorts of interesting things, from writing about them to writing about snails, was a real transition. And I still talk to snail behavioural biologists. There are those people still studying snail memory and learning and stress, and there's bits of that in the book, but it's obviously like chalk and cheese into comparing ravens and snails. So that for me was a real transition, and really drove home the need to cultivate completely different skills in some ways when you shift taxa. Even working with the same kinds of multi-species approaches, I went from thinking mostly about behavioural biology and ecology to thinking actually an awful lot about taxonomy and about the minutiae of shell differences and how different species it would, because that's a real issue for snail conservation when you're not even sure if these two snails are the same or different species. You can't be sure whether they're endangered, certainly, or how to go about conserving them. So all of the fields of science and the questions shift in ways, and part of what shifts with them are all of these ethical and social and political questions that we've been paying attention to. They morph to with the taxa, which I think is, and I'm sure fungi are a totally different world again.
Well, I feel very lucky to have gotten involved with fungi, because just as I was working on them was the time that biology itself was shifting to move beyond the autonomy of particular organisms, to begin to see how interspecies interactions were so important to development, ecology, and evolution itself, that where evolution had been so clearly understood as having a single taxa as the heart of it and how it reproduced itself, suddenly the learning about horizontal gene transfer, about interspecies relations, about all of these revolutionary new ways to understand evolution in the world, coincided with this period when I was working on fungi, where the kind of fungi I'm working on, which have an interrelationship with trees and can't feed themselves without the carbohydrates from the trees, and in turn help those trees to grow and to build forests, that happened to be a very fortuitous moment for me through which to understand how these fungi were working in the world. And I just have to say, back to the thing about crows, when I realized that there was a field called mushroom sociology, it really took me by surprise, because I hadn't thought of that. But in fact, the social relations of fungi, not only with each other, but with plants, because at what point and for succession might you find a particular kind of mushroom under what kinds of social conditions, that it really was the catalyst for me to start thinking of social relations as always multi-species relations, and much more than the traditional idea that only humans were involved in sociology.
Yeah. Oh, that's a whole other line of things I'd love to talk to you about one day, but we'll have to add that to a list. I think we've just got one topic to continue talking about, which I guess we've already been talking about a fair bit, which is collaborating with scientists, which is a strong theme in both of our work, and something that we're both continually trying to do differently and to learn more about. Yeah, did you want to say a little bit about your current projects or past projects collaborating with scientists?
Sure. I think if we're serious about tackling environmental problems, that the humanities sciences divide is just not doing us any good. But it's a challenge working across that rift. It's a challenge in every way without just making the scientists the objects of philosophical kinds of inquiries on the one hand, or forcing the humanists to do a kind of scientific quantitative analysis on the other. So it's been, so like you, been trying to think about the possibilities of a decolonized natural history at the heart of collaborations. And I'll just tell about one project in which I'm not a primary researcher, but I've been part of a research team and feel very privileged. That part of the story about it is that it took us 4 years to figure out our object of analysis. So these are slow things, and in the good kind of slowness that Isabel Stengers talks about as giving rise to a slow science, a science in which figuring out what matters is part of the process. We have a little project called Marine Hitchhikers with Joe Klein and Peter Funk and Stina Vespu. And we want to understand all of the little creatures that travel around the world with global trade in marine products, but weren't invited along. So part of it took us that long, in part because we had to figure out what organisms we really could work with this particular team. We're looking at the international trade in corals, live corals coming out of Indonesia, and the little tiny fragments of sponges that get caught in the holes of coral. And then when they get to an aquarium somewhere, they come out and they form new sponges. And so it's a little model for us for the ways that organisms are traveling around the world. And the excitement of it in part was that it took us a very long time to figure out what the other side was talking about, that even we're trying to write grant proposals and to figure out that the concept, the term method meant something completely different to the biologists and the humanists, that they were completely unrelated. So that in that way, the challenge to the common sense words that we had, to the approaches, and the excitement of going to an aquarium and having them show us all of these invasive sponges that were coating all the tanks that they hadn't asked for, but came in with the corals. So it's a project that's pulling me forward into what I can notice in the world. But I know you've got some really cool projects going on with this. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, well, the project I'm trying to start work on now, just as I've come to the end of working on the snail book, is looking at, in a way, stuff that's been going on for decades in the sciences, but that has been since the 90s talked about as conservation behaviour, and especially in the last 10 years has, I think, begun to develop a really interesting kind of momentum within conservation biology. And so it's a field that's looking at how understanding animal behaviour better can create new conservation opportunities. So there's all sorts of elements to how that might be the case. But the stuff that really interests me is the efforts to change animal behaviour in some way, to teach animals to live differently for their own or others' survival. And so that includes all sorts of things like teaching animals not to eat endangered species, teaching endangered animals not to eat toxic species like the cane toads, but also using the development of things like biofences, where scientists are using scent markers to try and convince a group of predators, whether it's wolves or African wild dogs, that there's another pack beyond the edge of their territory, and so to keep them within the protected area with a scent fence instead of a physical fence, and so in that way, hopefully, to reduce conflict with farmers and others. So all sorts of really interesting sites where scientists are trying, conservationists are trying to use animal behavior for conservation purposes. And I guess what really fascinates me about it is the need for a really intimate knowledge of how animals make sense of the world, how they learn. And so these scientists are really diving into that stuff in a different way to how that's been done in labs with rats or in other contexts. It's being done in the field with real life and death conservation stakes often, and not just conservation stakes, but livestock and livelihoods and other things are at stake as well. So it's a site then necessarily where human communities intersect with conservation practice, which always interests me. But here you've got, in addition to the really interesting scientific efforts to understand and intervene in animal behaviour, you've got local communities with their own understandings of and efforts to intervene in animal behaviour. And those things are also coming together. And meanwhile, the animals themselves are learning and adapting to these changing conservation or intervention regimes. So these are really interesting ecologies that are all about learning and adaptation and responsiveness. And a lot of them are really hopeful, like a project some colleagues of mine are doing in New Zealand, Peter Banks and Catherine Price, where they're using what they call olfactory camouflage to basically trick rats and stoats and other mammalian predators out of eating the eggs of ground nesting birds. So they use the scent of birds, they put it liberally around the environment before the breeding season starts. And these predators come and investigate looking for eggs and food. And they do this for a couple of weeks, and the predators find no food. And so by the time that the birds arrive and start laying, they've learned that scent is an unreliable indicator of food, and they ignore the nesting birds. So anyway, that's producing really good results in the preliminary trials. And normally you would have to kill those mammalian predators with poison or traps. And so here they're able to kind of intervene in a problematic behavior rather than having to eradicate or it's very rarely eradication. That's ongoing treadmills of killing year after year to try and keep the numbers down. So there's really hopeful things there, but then the flip side, of course, is some of this behavioural knowledge is also being used to develop better ways of killing animals. So traditional approaches to trapping problematic animals often miss really shy individuals who aren't bold enough to go up and investigate this thing in their environment. So how can we use that knowledge about the different personalities of animals to kill them better? And I think there's something really interesting and somewhat disturbing, but in this intersection where I think so many scientists have for so long resisted this notion of animal personalities and resisted thinking about individual difference and focused on species generalities. And here, when it becomes a useful mechanism for killing more effectively, all of a sudden everyone's happy to talk about animal personalities because it's lost this kind of fluffiness as a concept. And I think that's only one element of what's going on here, but it's fascinating to be studying, interrogating animal individuality and personality with the goal of extinguishing it. I think that opens up a really interesting dynamics. There's obviously so many questions here, and that's a project where I think it would be really helpful to have ethnographers thinking with local communities about these sites of management. But I think also there's a role for history and philosophy of science kinds of approaches and thinking about concepts of agency and ethics and how they are being redone in these kinds of intersections. So that's one project where I hope to work more closely with scientists, not just studying them, but collaborate.
It's really fascinating. And it does bring up the fact that when I described marine hitchhikers, I forgot to explain why you needed people from the humanities as well as the sciences. So it's a little different, but equally interesting. I think scientists natural scientists usually don't have time to study human activities. So something like trade just goes in a black box. There it is, trade. But what the anthropologists do, the ethnographers, are figuring out, exactly what the kinds of groups are involved in doing what. When they say they're quarantining a set of corals, what are they actually doing? Maybe leaving it in a non-air conditioned office. What kinds of organisms can survive the kinds of pieces of the commodity chain? So they're creating a kind of knowledge that the natural scientists do not have. And the same way the natural scientists, the anthropologists really don't know enough about sponges to even know exactly how to figure out what kinds of sponges these are, these tiny fragments. And so I'm hoping for a kind of collaboration where both sides aren't just evaluating each other, but are together producing something that will show us more about these Anthropocene histories in which humans and non-humans are both part of the story that's emerging.